Okay, welcome back. We're talking about conservation biogeography this week, and I want to get into a little bit more about what we might call the ecogeography of humanity, or really how humans tend to interact with our environment and the relationships that, the impacts we have on the environment and the impacts that the environment can have on us. So let's take a look at some of these things. One pattern we tend to see is that humans, when we move into a new area, tend to access the resources of that area in ways. Basically, we're accessing the resources that are closest and easiest for us to get to first, and then sort of progressively working our way out. And a really great example of this is if we look at timber harvesting patterns in the Olympic Peninsula here, sort of Olympic National Forest. Over time, if we look at this figure, we can see that natural losses, if we look at the cumulative area of deforestation here over time, natural losses, tends to be pretty static. It doesn't change a whole lot over this like 250-year period. But then you can see once we introduce, humans and modern timber harvesting practices somewhere in the mid, humans were obviously in this area before then, but we really started to develop our timber harvesting practices and new technologies came about around this time. You see this huge increase that allowed us to basically harvest a lot more. And what you can sort of see is that so I think this figure shows it best, where you see the elevation of deforested sites. For natural loss, there's sort of pretty high elevation, but there's not a whole lot of change over time. But you can see deforested sites due to timber harvest, we started at the lowest sites and then rapidly worked our way up. Same thing for the slopes of these areas. It doesn't change a whole lot for natural loss, but when it comes to timber harvesting, we started at the lowest and very quickly worked our way up. And if you're just looking at the time period of 1930 to 1990, you can see this increasing trend of accessing more timber harvesting from south to north. So basically the pattern is we tend to take whatever's closest to us and then progressively work our way out from there, which makes sense. You wouldn't want to, if you're expanding, you're probably going to take what's closest to you and easiest to get to, and then you're going to eventually run out there and then have to go to harder and harder, more remote areas. So that's been something that's happened throughout history quite a few times. Um, Something else is, so that's sort of, just one example of how we impact the environment, but the environment also impacts us. So there's one pattern is that indigenous populations of humans often adapt to local environment conditions, and they exhibit patterns consistent with ecogeographic rules. One of those rules is, just ignore these for a second, something called Bergman's rule, which I already talked about a little bit, but we're naming it now, which is that body size tends to increase with latitude and decrease with mean annual temperature. So here you're seeing latitude, and as we increase in latitude, our body mass of indigenous populations is on our y-axis, tends to increase with latitude, and same thing tends to decrease with increasing mean annual temperature. So that's what's known as Bergman's rule, and it's not necessarily, or it's not exclusive to humans, but you can see that humans fit that trend pretty well. Another rule that humans tend to fit is the Allen's rule, which is relative length of appendages tends to decrease with latitude and increase with mean annual temperature. So we have the brachial index, and it's not super important you know what that is. It's just sort of like a measure of like limb length, and is a sort of a proxy for limb length. And you can see that it decreases with latitude in human populations, and again increases with temperature. So human populations fit Allen's rule pretty well as well. So you can see that humans, we usually tend to think of humans as having some drastic impact on our environment, and we do. That's definitely true. But the environment also impacts us from an evolutionary perspective as well. Okay, so coming back to this, and this is a cool thing. So coming back to what I was talking about earlier in the last video of languages, the diversity of human languages exhibits basically trends of island biogeography. So here we're looking at languages on a bunch of islands in the Pacific, which tend to increase. The diversity tends to increase with island area and decrease with island isolation. So what you're seeing here is the number of languages on these islands, and we're sort of separating them out by the date of first settlement, but basically that's, corresponds to their isolation. And you can see islands that are close to these mainlands have a lot more languages than islands that are far more isolated tend to have fewer languages. So that very closely fits the island biogeographic pattern. In fact, we can fit this model to it, and say, linguistic diversity on islands again decreases isolation and increases with area. So as area increases, the number of languages tends to increase, and this is mostly a function of the borrowing of new words, and the rate of borrowing of new words and the rate of loss of share words, and you can again get a rate of turnover of language, very similar to how we look at a rate of turnover of species on these areas. And we can look at, we can fit different models based on whether they're near islands or far islands or small or large populations, very similar to the ways that we do this for island biogeography with species diversity. So that's pretty interesting. I think that they behave in this similar sort of pattern. Okay, so that's sort of a very brief overview. Obviously, you could spend a lot more time talking about how humans impact the environment, and or how the environment impacts humans. But let's sort of look now, getting more into what humans have been doing recently, which, as you are probably familiar with, is been pretty destructive habits of humans when we come into an area that has pretty much led to overwhelming crisis in biodiversity globally. So this is an example of the diversity of native forest birds in the kingdom of Tonga on these islands has decreased dramatically since the island was colonized by Polynesians. So this isn't even, this is just showing an example. Even before like modern times, this is something that happened characteristically when humans moved into an area. You can see that basically you have pre-human, archaeological, historic, and basically modern, what we're calling modern times on our x-axis here for all of these charts. And then the number of species of all land bird species for these areas tended to decrease over time after humans, basically you have pre-human, and then anything after here is post-human basically contact, and you get that decreasing trend. But there's actually different patterns for different species, and so some organisms have types of birds in this specific area. Their ecological niche and their other characteristics may influence a little bit their response to this, and they may fare a little bit better than others. Specifically, if we look at this chart, sort of the foraging height of different groups of birds, we can sort of see that the aerial species of birds tended to fare much better. First of all, they were really low, and maybe humans played a role in introduction of these species because they actually increase over time, whereas other groups tend to decrease over time. So there's nuanced stuff going on, but as a whole, humans tended to decrease the diversity of these groups. And that's definitely not exclusive to that group. So here we're looking at global extinctions in some major groups of animals and plants during the past 500 years and the status of these major groups and animals. And basically what you're seeing here is the number of species that have gone extinct in the wild. I think that's probably like we knew about them, but we didn't necessarily document their extinction. We think they're probably extinct. And then there's also possibly extinct. And really what we're trying to highlight here, or what I think is highlighted here, I mean, you see a lot of extinctions, and you can see the relative, some groups like mollusks have been disproportionately influenced in birds compared to reptiles and other things. But you're also seeing, how much we don't know. And this goes back to like day one of this class, I think, when we talked about the fact that, there's a lot of species that we know of. There's probably possibly way more that we don't know of. And that sort of the scary part of this is like how many are going extinct that we don't even know of, that we never document and disappear before we even realize they ever existed. And this sort of idea is called the Linnaean shortfall, which is the discrepancy between the number of known species and the total number of species in existence. So basically, there's just all these species out there that we don't know of. We don't even know how many we don't know. Um, and so the fear is that, which is probably a guarantee that we've lost tons of species without ever knowing that they ever existed, which is sort of a kind of sad thing. But it's also there's all this opportunity for biologists to name things and discover things and sort of get out there and increase our knowledge. There's a great need for that. So that's sort of what we're seeing here. And again, we could break this up by different species and different types of species, or sorry, different groups of species, and look at their relative status as far as being endangered. I think probably if you were to look at these two separately, you might miss something, but I think what is going on here is that in these um, invertebrates, there's lots and lots, especially insects, there's lots and lots of species that we don't know of. And so some of these charts can be misleading when you say, if we knew about more, then we would have to document much more species being endangered or on the brink of extinction if we had that knowledge. But I think probably the takeaway here is that you have this shortfall and this discrepancy is a big problem for conservation biogeography and conservation biology. If you're trying to conserve these species, then you have to know what the problem is, and you have to document it beforehand. So that's not only are we having problems with conservation, but also just knowing how big the problem is. If we look at conservation status in oceanic communities, again, I'm not going to read through this whole table, but coral reefs critically endangered. Some of the drivers: overfishing, warming, acidification of the ocean is a big one due to increased CO2. Estuaries and coastal seas critically endangered. Again, overfishing, runoff from agriculture, also warming due to the rise of CO2, invasive species. Continental shelves that are endangered, also overfishing, trophic cascades, probably changing the nutrient loads, acidification and warming. So a lot of these, the same problems are contributing to lots and lots of problems. Threatened status, community status in the open ocean, again, overfishing, trophic cascades, warming, acidification. So we know what the problems are. We've known for a long time. It's really about getting the political will to deal with these sorts of things. If we want to look globally at different groups, we can see that pretty much for any index you want to look at, there's been large scale decreases in the biodiversity indices. So the Living Planet Index, which is a mean population of vertebrates, a 31% decrease over this time period. The Wild Bird Index, a 16% decrease over this period. Actually, an increase in wetland species, which I thought was interesting. The Waterbird Population Index, a 33% decrease. Red List Index of mammals, birds, and amphibians and corals, 6%. And all of these, pretty much all of them, except for a couple, we're seeing large-scale decreases over these time periods. And that's not new. Habitat destruction has been one of the main drivers of this, and that's pretty much characteristic of humans. When we go to anywhere and expand, we tend to use those resources. And now we live in, we have global capitalism that reinforces these ideas where we need growth pretty much at all costs. And so growth requires resources. And so we just continue to use these resources. Going back to this idea, we're finding new species all the time, and that's a great thing. But a lot of the times we find these new species and they're on the brink of extinction, or they're they're endangered, and usually the ones we're finding are endemic to certain areas. And so we're always finding more, but the problem is, I think we still are only scratching the surface of the iceberg, so to speak, of species that we know of versus how many are actually in existence. And this sort of highlights that. I think, walking through, there's the Linnaean shortfall. There's several shortfalls in terms of our knowledge of biologic diversity. There's a Linnaean shortfall, which, most Earth species have not been described or cataloged. There's the Wallacean shortfall. Basically, our knowledge of the geographic distribution of these species is incomplete, being pretty much inadequate at all scales. So not only do we, in this case, it gets to another layer, basically we're just increasing in complexity. There's the fact that we don't know some species exist, but even if we find a new one, that doesn't mean we necessarily know its full geographic distribution. We don't necessarily know its species abundance and the dynamics over space and time. That's the Bristonian shortfall. The Darwinian shortfall is the lack of knowledge about sort of the evolutionary history of species and their traits. I mean, obviously, if there's species that we don't know of, we don't know their evolutionary histories because we don't know of them. We don't necessarily know their traits and their ecological functions, their niche space, so to speak. We don't know their responses and tolerances of abiotic conditions, those relationships between the environment and how a species interacts with the environment, and those sorts of things. So all of those things, contribute to shortfalls, and there's tons of information we don't know. So all of this combined, leads to a lot of uncertainty about how species are going to respond to things like climate change and continued alterations of their environments. So that's a part of that biodiversity crisis. Okay, so I'm going to pause this video here. There's an interesting reading here about changing species names that has to do with colonialism and language and and taxonomy and how we document species names that I think is relevant to this conversation. So keep working your way through this module and go work through the reading. And as usual, I'll see you in the next video.